The Pawnbroker is easily one of the most morally courageous and institutionally despised productions in the history of American cinema. A 1964 film that every major studio refused to distribute, that the Catholic Church officially condemned, that Jewish groups urged audiences to boycott, that the Motion Picture Association tried to suppress, and that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences subsequently failed to reward, and which, in the process of surviving all of that, broke the production code, changed the grammar of Holocaust filmmaking forever, and produced one of the most devastating lead performances in the history of American film. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the film with 21 dark facts you didn't know about The Pawnbroker, including the novelist who died at 36 before he ever saw a single frame of it, the studio that demanded a happy ending about a concentration camp survivor, and the night at the Academy Awards when Rod Steiger was already buttoning his jacket before he heard the wrong name called. Edward Lewis Wallant published The Pawnbroker in 1961. He was 34 years old. The novel was a National Book Award finalist. It secured him a Guggenheim Fellowship. It established him, almost immediately, as one of the most urgent and morally serious voices in post-war American Jewish fiction, a writer whose proximity to Saul Bellow and Philip Roth was noted by critics who sensed something even rawer, even less protected by irony in his prose. In December 1962, shortly after returning from European travels funded by his Guggenheim, Wallant suffered a sudden cerebral aneurysm. He fell into a coma. He never woke up. He died on December 5th, 1962, at the age of 36, survived by his wife and 3 children. The film adaptation of his novel premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival in June 1964, earned Rod Steiger the Best Actor prize, and went on to become one of the most discussed American films of the decade. Edward Lewis Wallant never knew. He had been dead for 18 months before a single frame was developed. Now, to understand what the novel almost became on its way to the screen, you have to understand the specific institutional cowardice of the studio that first acquired it. What makes Wallant's achievement with The Pawnbroker particularly remarkable is the circumstances under which it was written. He was not a full-time novelist. He worked during the day as an art director at McCann Erickson, one of Madison Avenue's most prestigious advertising agencies, writing copy and designing campaigns for Bulova, Chalk, Folo Nuts, and Oreo biscuits, among others. The novel was written at night. At a kitchen table, in the hours after his family was in bed, Wallant assembled a portrait of a man broken by the worst atrocity in modern history. Working in the only hours the day left him after he had spent it selling consumer goods, he published 2 novels in his lifetime. 2 more appeared posthumously. All 4 were written in the margins of a full-time advertising career. The discipline required is almost incomprehensible. So is the loss. So, what happened when that novel reached Hollywood? MGM acquired the rights to Wallant's novel. Their first instinct was to relocate the story entirely, not to East Harlem, New York, but to Soho, London, and to cast the impeccably British James Mason in the lead role. When that proposal failed to materialize, MGM turned to the script, and what they wanted from it was, by any standard, grotesque. They demanded changes including, reportedly, a more upbeat conclusion, a happy ending. For a film about a Holocaust survivor whose emotional death is the entire point, whose survival is indistinguishable throughout the narrative from a form of permanent dying, the studio's instinct was to find the exit that left the audience feeling better. Producer Ely Landau refused. The project moved to independent financing, with Landau committing $1.2 million of his own money to make a film that every major studio in Hollywood had, at that point, chosen not to make. Without his willingness to personally back a story about a man who cannot feel, there is no film. But even with independent financing secured, the production faced a succession of creative refusals that reads, in retrospect, like a catalog of institutional fear. Stanley Kubrick, Carl Rice, and Franco Zeffirelli all turned the project down. Kubrick's stated reason was that he found Rod Steiger, already attached, not all that exciting as a performer. Rice's reason was of an entirely different order. His parents had been murdered in the Holocaust. He said with considerable dignity that for deep personal reasons, he could not objectively associate himself with any subject which has a background of concentration camps. That is not a creative refusal. That is a wound so specific and so unhealed that putting it on screen was, for the man who carried it, not a professional possibility. Zeffirelli, then primarily a stage director and ambitious for his first significant English language film, said the subject was simply not one he would wish to direct, certainly not as his first Anglo-American venture. Three different refusals: contempt, grief, and ambition. The film found Sidney Lumet, but not, initially, without a further complication. Arthur Hiller was the original director attached to The Pawnbroker. He was fired before principal photography began. The production then turned to Sidney Lumet, who came aboard with a full complement of misgivings, not about the material, but about the man he was inheriting in the lead role. Sidney Lumet's private assessment of Rod Steiger, offered to film historian Mark Harris and quoted in Harris's landmark 2008 study, Pictures at a Revolution, is one of the most surgically unflattering director on actor evaluations on record. Lumet said Steiger was a rather tasteless actor, awfully talented, but completely tasteless in his choices. He elaborated with a comparison that is, in its way, almost admirably specific. He likened Steiger to a New York newspaper columnist of the period, of whom a mutual friend had once said, "For 5 cents, he gives you too much." Lumet's preferred choice for the role was James Mason, the same actor MGM had wanted when they were planning the London relocation. Cool, precise, internally complex without ever declaring it. The opposite of everything Lumet feared about Steiger. He cast Steiger anyway because the actor had already committed to the project, had been involved in early script development, and had accepted a fee drastically below his market rate to be in the film. And then, during rehearsals, Steiger did something that Lumet had not anticipated. He agreed, quietly and completely, with Lumet's entire approach to the character's emotional repression. Lumet conceded, in interviews afterward, that Steiger had worked out fine. Now, Steiger was not the only surprising person who had expressed interest in playing Sol Nazarman. Groucho Marx, the comedian, the vaudeville veteran, the man with the grease paint mustache and the machine gun one-liners, had wanted to play Sol Nazarman. This is not a rumor. It is documented. Groucho was in his mid-70s at the time and had spent decades defining a specific and highly particular comic persona. He wanted the pawnbroker. He wanted the role of a man destroyed by the Holocaust, hollowed out by grief, living in East Harlem behind the bars of his own pawnshop like an animal in a cage that has forgotten it was ever anything else. Whether a Groucho Marx Nazarman would have been a catastrophic miscasting or a genuinely strange and interesting piece of cinema is a question that cannot be answered. What the curiosity tells us, at minimum, is that the power and the darkness of the role were visible from the very beginning, reaching across genre lines to attract performers with no obvious claim on it. By 1962, when Rod Steiger became attached to The Pawnbroker, he had spent nearly a decade trying to convert a celebrated early nomination into the leading man career it should have produced. His performance as Charlie Malloy in Elia Kazan's On the Waterfront in 1954, the scene in the back of the cab with Marlon Brando, 8 minutes of acting so precisely calibrated that film schools still use it, had earned him his first Academy Award nomination. Then, for almost 10 years, nothing fully matched it. He cycled through supporting roles, character parts, films of varying quality, without quite achieving the gravitational center that his talent warranted. He was, by the early 1960s, what the industry considers a reliable character actor with an unsatisfied leading man ambition. The Pawnbroker was the role that changed that. It was also, paradoxically, a role that Lumet, the director he trusted enough to work with, did not initially believe he could play. Rod Steiger was paid $50,000 for The Pawnbroker. This was, by any accounting, a fraction of his standard rate. He accepted it because he trusted Lumet, with whom he had worked on live television, and because he understood, with complete conviction, what the role was. He had been involved in early script development. He had read Wallen's novel. He knew what Sol Nazarman was carrying, and he knew what it would cost him as a performer to carry it on screen. He took the pay cut and made the film. In his final television interview on an episode of Dinner for Five in 2002, Steiger called The Pawnbroker his favorite film of his career. By a long shot. He said it without qualification or nostalgia. He said it as a plain statement of fact. From a man who had, in the intervening decades, also made In the Heat of the Night and won the Oscar he was denied for this one. Now, inside the preparation for that performance, Steiger found an inspiration from an entirely unexpected source. In a 1999 television interview, Steiger disclosed what had given him the specific emotional key to The Pawnbroker's final minutes, the scene in which Sol's accumulated, armored, deliberately cultivated numbness finally cracks open. The inspiration was Pablo Picasso's Guernica, painted in 1937 in response to the Nazi bombing of the Basque town of that name. Specifically, Steiger borrowed the posture and the silent anguish of one of the suffering figures in the painting, the skyward cry, the mouth open in a scream that makes no sound, the gesture of a body in extremis. He transposed that figure's particular and wordless agony into the final minutes of the film. A painting made in grief over fascist violence, translated 27 years later into a performance about a man who survived fascist violence. The genealogy is exact and the debt is real. Production designer Richard Silbert, who would later design Chinatown, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and Rosemary's Baby, approached the pawnshop set as a problem of architectural psychology. His solution was precise and unsparing. The entire interior of the shop was designed as a system of cages, wire mesh, bars, locks, security alarms. Every visual element that the set contained was chosen to make the shop feel like an extension of the concentration camp rather than an escape from it. The intention was to communicate, without a word of dialogue, that Sol Nazarman had not, in any meaningful sense, been liberated in 1945. He had transferred from one form of confinement to another. The barbed wire of Auschwitz had become the security mesh of a Harlem pawnshop, and the man behind the counter had not been able to move in 20 years. Cinematographer Boris Kaufman, who had won an Oscar for On the Waterfront, lit the space to reinforce this. Shadowed, gridded, inescapable. Sidney Lumet's approach to the film's flashback sequences, the intrusions of concentration camp memory into the present-day Harlem narrative, drew directly from the French New Wave, and specifically from two films by Alain Resnais, Hiroshima Mon Amour, 1959, and Night and Fog, 1956. The technique involved shot cuts of extreme brevity, single frame cuts, two frame cuts, at moments when the present-day world triggered a memory that the character could not suppress. The standard assumption in editing at the time was that an audience required a minimum of 3 frames to register an image at all. Lumet and editor Ralph Rosenblum broke below that threshold deliberately, inserting flashes of memory so brief they registered not as images but as sensations, a shudder in the visual cortex rather than a coherent picture. A crowded subway car becomes, for a fraction of a second, a cattle truck. A basketball court fence becomes, for a fraction of a second, a camp perimeter wire. The technique was, at the time, formally radical. It is now understood as one of the defining innovations in the grammar of screen trauma. The single scene that brought the entire edifice of Hollywood's production code crashing down was approximately 15 seconds long. A black prostitute named Mabel Wheatley, played by Thelma Oliver, exposes her breast to Sol Nazarman in the pawnshop, attempting to secure a loan. Sol, behind his cage of wire mesh, sees in that moment not what is in front of him but a flashback. His wife Ruth in the concentration camp, being forced into sexual slavery by Nazi guards. The nudity in the present triggers the horror of the past. It is, formally, the most precise and morally justified use of the female body in the history of American mainstream cinema to that point. A direct and unambiguous equation between the sexual exploitation of black women in contemporary America and the sexual exploitation of Jewish women in Nazi Germany. It is not titillating. It is annihilating. And every studio in Hollywood refused to distribute the film because of it. The film was rejected by every major Hollywood studio for distribution on the basis of that scene, and a separate bedroom sequence between 2 other characters, which the Production Code Administration described in its official rejection notice as unacceptably sex-suggestive and lustful. Lumet had, with deliberate intent, chosen not to film a protection shot, an alternative take of the nude scene without nudity that would have given the studio a fallback option. There was no fallback. The film existed as it was, or it did not exist. The PCA rejected it. Jeffrey Sherlock, who administered the code, warned producer Ely Landau explicitly that the Legion of Decency would condemn it. Landau prepared to release the film without a production code seal, a commercially devastating option that would have effectively barred the film from mainstream theaters through the Allied Artist Distribution Company. The Catholic Legion of Decency issued the Pawnbroker a C, condemned, rating, its most severe classification, stating publicly that condemnation was necessary in order to put a very definite halt to the effort by producers to introduce nudity into American films. What the Legion statement did not engage with, could not engage with, because its institutional function was moral policing rather than aesthetic judgment, was that the nudity in question was inseparable from the film's central argument about the ongoing, unacknowledged horror of what had been done to Jewish women in the Nazi camps. The National Council of Churches took the opposite view. It gave The Pawnbroker its award for Best Picture of the Year, two Christian institutions, looking at the same film, reaching diametrically opposite conclusions, one seeing indecency, one seeing necessary and courageous truth. The distance between those two positions describes, with some precision, the distance between institutional religion and moral seriousness. With Steiger's Silver Bear Best Actor prize from Berlin in hand, and with allied artists prepared to distribute without a code seal, producer Landau appealed directly to the MPAA's appeals board. Oscar-winning director Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who sat on that board, urged Lumet to make the case himself. Lumet did. On a vote of 6-3, the board granted The Pawnbroker an exemption, declaring it, in language that is a masterpiece of institutional self-protection, a special and unique case, while simultaneously insisting that the decision will not, however, set a precedent. The New York Times reported those words with a straight face. Mark Harris, writing in Pictures at a Revolution in 2008, called the MPAA's action the first of a series of injuries to the production code that would prove fatal within 3 years. The code was abolished in 1968, replaced by the voluntary rating system that still exists today. The precedent that was not going to be set had, within 3 years, ended the production code entirely. The Pawnbroker had its world premiere at the Berlin International Film Festival in June 1964. The choice of Berlin, the capital of the nation that had constructed and operated the concentration camps that the film depicts, was not incidental. It was an act of deliberate and considerable moral weight, screening a portrait of Holocaust survival in the city most identified, in the global imagination, with the perpetration of the Holocaust. The German audience received it. Rod Steiger won Best Actor. The reception in Berlin gave the film a critical and commercial foundation that its American distribution difficulties had, to that point, threatened to permanently deny it. It is one of the more extraordinary ironies in the film's biography. The country responsible for the reality the film depicts was the first to publicly honor the performance that made the reality bearable to witness. At the 1966 Academy Awards ceremony, Rod Steiger was nominated for Best Actor for The Pawnbroker. The nomination was widely regarded in the industry and in the press as the frontrunner's nomination as the award that was going to be given, because the performance was the one that had to be recognized. Steiger himself reportedly felt the same. In the moment before the envelope was opened, he began to button his jacket, the physical preparation of a man about to rise from his seat and walk to a stage. He heard the name Lee Marvin. Marvin had won for Cat Ballou, a comedic western in which he played dual roles with broad physical comedy. Steiger's response, recorded in his memoir, was not rage but something more complicated. A lesson, he said, in never taking happiness or recognition for granted. He described the moment as a spanking from the forces of nature. 2 years later, in 1968, Steiger won the Academy Award for Best Actor for In the Heat of the Night, directed by the same man, Norman Jewison, who understood what Steiger was capable of when no one else wanted to find out. Morgan Freeman makes his feature film debut in The Pawnbroker. He is uncredited. He appears briefly. Nothing in those frames suggests, to any reasonable observer watching in 1964, that what they are seeing is the beginning of one of the most sustained and widely admired careers in American screen acting. This is the nature of debut appearances. They are legible only in retrospect, saturated with meaning that the moment itself cannot contain. Freeman went on to Street Smart, Driving Miss Daisy, The Shawshank Redemption, SE7N, $1 Million Baby. The beginning of that career is a few seconds of footage in a Holocaust drama that every studio in Hollywood refused to distribute. The genealogy is strange and it is real. Brock Peters plays Rodriguez, the gangster who uses the pawn shop as a front for his criminal operation and whose money, Soul knows with complete and degrading clarity, is generated through prostitution. What is less frequently discussed about the character is that Rodriguez lives openly with a male partner, making him not only the first openly gay character in a mainstream American film, but, specifically, the first openly gay black character in the history of American mainstream cinema. The production code explicitly prohibited the sympathetic depiction of homosexuality. Rodriguez is not sympathetic. He is a criminal who profits from the exploitation of women, but his sexuality is present, acknowledged, and not punished by the narrative specifically because of his sexual orientation. The film, already in open conflict with the code over nudity, had broken another of its prohibitions without fanfare and without apology. Embedded inside a performance from Peters that remains one of the most quietly authoritative in the film, The Pawnbroker was attacked from two directions simultaneously. Some Jewish community groups urged a boycott on the grounds that a Jewish pawnbroker, associated historically with money lending, with the stereotype of financial exploitation, was a character whose cultural visibility would encourage anti-Semitism rather than combat it. Some black community groups condemned the film for its portrayal of East Harlem's residents as pimps, prostitutes, drug addicts, and gangsters, arguing that it reinforced racial stereotyping rather than challenging it. Both critiques were made in good faith by people with entirely legitimate reasons to be alert to exactly these dangers. Both critiques missed or refused the film's actual argument, that Sol Nazerman specifically sought out a community he could hold in contempt, because contempt was the only emotion he could still feel without shattering, and that the film's portrait of Harlem was inseparable from its portrait of a man who had designed his own isolation as a form of survival. The film did not romanticize Harlem. It did not romanticize Saul. It refused to romanticize anything. That refusal was, ultimately, its deepest and most uncomfortable act of honesty. The critical establishment received The Pawnbroker with considerable respect upon its eventual release in March 1965. The New York Times' Bosley Crowther praised Steiger's performance at length, describing Nazerman as very much a person of today. The film won the New York Film Critics Circle Awards for Best Film and Best Director. Steiger received his Berlin Prize, his Oscar nomination, and the near-universal agreement of serious film critics that what he had done in the role was exceptional. And yet, the film received only one Academy Award nomination, solely for Steiger's performance, and failed to convert commercial audiences in numbers that matched its critical standing. The weight of what it was asking audiences to sit with, not as spectacle, not as catharsis, but as a sustained, inescapable presence of a man who has been destroyed and cannot be repaired, was 65 audience, genuinely demanding. But nowadays, The Pawnbroker is recognized as a foundational work of American cinema. The film that broke the production code's most entrenched prohibition, that introduced the American mainstream to the psychological aftermath of the Holocaust rather than its historical spectacle, and that established a grammar of screen trauma that subsequent filmmakers, from Alan Pakula to Steven Spielberg, built upon directly. It is preserved in the United States National Film Registry. Its formal innovations, the shock cut, the design cage, the refusal of resolution remain instructive, and the performance at its center, delivered by a man who was paid a fraction of his worth to make a film that no studio wanted to release, remains, across 60 years, one of the most complete and devastating pieces of screen acting in the American tradition. But let me know below. When it comes to The Pawnbroker and the ongoing question it raises about American cinema's relationship to historical atrocity, do you think Hollywood has ever genuinely reckoned with the Holocaust? Or does the instinct toward uplift, resolution, and the survivable ending, the instinct that made MGM demand a happy ending in 1963, still fundamentally shape how the industry tells this story?